Hey, everybody. I am Pastor Bill Tucker with Pastor Zach McIntosh, and this is Isolation Bible Study coming from Concordia here in San Antonio. And today we're going to be talking about the sermon from yesterday, and really for these 2 weeks, kind of following through on a theme regarding mental health. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But I wanted to mention one of the things that I'm really excited about is the 4-week series on Philippians that Dr. Jeff Kloa is doing from Museum of the Bible.
Yeah, he kicked it off last weekend, and last weekend was kind of an introduction to the whole letter and a little bit of background on the guy who wrote the letter, the Apostle Paul, and he did a great job. He is a very smart guy, so he has a lot of background information. And so if you haven't had a chance to watch that yet, you can either go back and watch the stream on Facebook. It's on our Facebook page, or if you want to, you can just podcast it. And he's also taking questions. So if you listen and you go, I'm not quite sure I caught all of that, or I'd like to know more about that, tell me more about Paul, or tell me more about this letter to these Christians who are living in this town called Philippi, you can just send him your questions at online at concordia.cc, online at concordia.cc. We're going to pass all those questions along to Dr. Kloa, and at the beginning of next weekend's sessions, he's going to be answering your questions from this weekend. And so here's the idea. If you want your questions answered by someone who actually knows the answers, a world-class Bible scholar, he's definitely the guy to turn to, definitely the guy to go to. And so it's really exciting to have him teaching Bible class for the next few weeks.
So let's go back to something that you mentioned. So let's say I wasn't able to watch yesterday when it was broadcast live. What are the options that I have to be able to see this Bible study and participate?
So really, there are three options. You can go to our Facebook page, just scroll down a little bit, and you'll see the video from yesterday, so you can watch that. Or if you want to, you can go to our website, concordia.cc. If you go to the media page, you'll see old sermons and old Bible classes. You can go back and watch it there as well. Or just go to your favorite podcast service, search Bible class or Concordia Bible class, like in Apple Podcasts or whatever you use, and it'll pop up there, and you can just listen to the audio there while you're taking a walk or going grocery shopping or on the road or whatever. So 3 different options for you.
Great ways to participate. And again, what's a little bit unusual is that Jeff Kloa is really insistent. He wanted to be able to answer people's questions. And it's more difficult now because it's all online. And so the ability that we have for him to be able to pre-record the session, but be live at the beginning of next week's adult Bible class is really, really helpful. So people just send their questions to online at concordia.cc, and we'll get all of those questions to Dr. Kloa, and I'll bet he'll have an answer for every single one.
I'm guessing he does. He has a PhD, really intelligent guy, is really good with the language of the New Testament, Greek. He's done a lot of work on that. And he just knows a lot in general, because I think it takes at least a few credentials and a little bit of smarts to become the chief curatorial officer at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C.
Absolutely does. So let's dig in. That's available for you to watch. There'll be session 2 will be next Sunday for the first time at 1:00. But let's dig into the message from yesterday, because we began this series, and for Isolation Bible Study, we began talking about today the whole idea of mental health, because we're in crisis mode with regard to mental health in our culture.
Absolutely, we are. And one of the biggest ways that mental health is kind of rising to the top, I think, of a lot of people's minds, has to do specifically with depression. Now, mental health is one of those umbrella terms, right? It catches a lot of different things, everything from PTSD to eating disorders to things like obsessive compulsive disorder or bipolar disorder. And those are all incredibly critical things. In fact, my guess is that if you yourself don't struggle with some sort of mental health issue, you have someone that you love and that you're really close to who is struggling with what could be a very serious mental health issue. Sometimes it requires professional counseling. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it requires some sort of medication. Sometimes it doesn't. But we are all touched by this issue, and especially now with the rates of depression skyrocketing. There was a recent study, you mentioned it in your message, that came out recently that said in the first few months of this pandemic, rates of depression, symptoms of depression, they tripled in the first couple of months. People are experiencing depression at rapid rates. They're really struggling because this is so new to us. And let's face it, when you're kind of cooped worked up when you can't get out as much as you used to, or meet with friends as much as you used to, because so many of us, in fact, all of us, are created to be social creatures. That can really do a number on our heart and on our soul. And it's completely natural to wonder, is this kind of all there is? When am I going to be able to get out of this and get to a relational spot that feels a little bit better for me, or just get to a life spot that seems a little bit healthier for me?
Well, and one of the things that's really makes it even more difficult in my mind is the whole stigma. We have this cultural stigma with regard to mental health that oftentimes causes people to suffer and struggle for long periods of time without ever getting help. In fact, struggle for long periods of time by themselves in isolation, trying to keep this secret. And it's a horrible, horrible reality. In fact, Zach, it was interesting. I had a conversation today with someone who works mostly with uh, professional church workers, so pastors and teachers and DCEs and so forth. And they were telling me that their schedule, their appointments are completely filled for the next 2 weeks with professional church workers. That there are so many people struggling, and it's not just folks who are sitting in the pews, it's people who are standing on the pulpit as well. And so we need to be aware of that, and we need to get past that stigma to realize if something's wrong, something's wrong. If I need help, I need help. It doesn't matter if it's a broken leg or a cough or a fever or some kind of mental health issue. And while none of these sessions, by the way, are intended to be diagnostic, we are not pretending to be therapists or psychiatrists or counselors in any way, shape, or form. The closest we come to that is pastoral counseling, but we can raise the awareness of this issue. Maybe for some who are watching, it'll trigger, as you said, a thought about someone they love and say, oh, maybe we need to talk about that. Maybe we need to have a discussion. Or for someone who maybe is struggling with feelings of discouragement or depression, it just raise the awareness to say, it's time to do something. And we talked yesterday that something could be as simple as taking your temperature and adjusting the thermostat. In fact, why don't you talk about that illustration?
Yeah. So at the end of yesterday's message, so there's this guy who actually has spent a lot of time in Chicago. He's done a lot of research with Lifeway. He's pastored some amazing churches, including the Moody Bible Church in Chicago. And if you've been around the church world for a while, you may have heard of that church. It's a very famous church, and really has done a lot of good for the kingdom of God over the years. He talks about the difference between a thermostat and a thermometer. So a thermometer is one of those things, you stick on your forehead, or back in the old days, they were made of glass, and you stick it in your mouth and you have to keep it there for a couple of minutes.
Remember having to flick your wrist to get the mercury back down into the bulb? Yeah.
Yep. Those were days of yore, a long time ago, but there was the principle of the thermometer was always the same, to figure out whether or not you were running hot, whether you had a fever. And so if you were over 98.6, 99, 100, you knew that there was a problem. And so if it started getting too high, well, then you also knew that you had to maybe take corrective action. And so when I was a kid, it was generally Tylenol. You back it up a little further. Some people would take aspirin or something like that, ibuprofen. So what were you trying to do? Well, at that point, you had moved from just taking a reading with a thermometer to trying to actually adjust the thermostat on your body, because you knew that you were running a fever. And if you didn't watch it, if you didn't monitor it, if you didn't take care of it, in fact, if it got too bad, if you didn't go in and get medical care for it, well, you could wind up in some big trouble, and you could wind up even sicker than you already were. And what is true in our body, what we just kind of intuitively know when it comes to our body: take my thermometer, take my temperature, and then if I need to, try to adjust the thermostat a little bit in my body by going to the doctor or taking the appropriate medications. That's true with our mental health too. If we're running a fever, if we're feeling a little sickly in our soul, there are steps that we can take. There's help that we can get that can act as kind of a thermostat for our mental and our emotional health to get us back to running where we need to be running.
Yeah, terrific. So the thermometer gives us information about how we're doing. It's the thermostat that actually exerts leverage. It makes a change and gives us the opportunity to make adjustments. And so that's kind of language that we've used to talk about this. One other kind of foundational piece of information as we think about yesterday's message is the whole idea. So some years ago, we did a sermon series called Soul Keeping, and it was based on a book by John Ortberg of the same title. And we didn't really go through the book. We used that as supplemental material. We kind of leveraged off the book. And in soul keeping, maybe one of the most kind of important things that we came to understand is that our soul isn't a part of who we are. Our soul is the total of who we are. So our body, our mind, our spirit, the things that happen to us, the things that we do, all of that has an impact on our soul.
This is the way that the Old Testament Hebrew authors would often think through the soul. So the soul wasn't a part of you, the soul was you. The soul is you. And so you'll see this in the Psalms when they talk about like your soul magnifying the Lord. It's really just you who's praising the Lord. Or when God first creates creatures, when he first creates Adam and Eve, he makes them, actually the Hebrew is living souls. So it's everything about you. Now, I actually got a question about this just this morning. When you get into the Greek way of thinking, that slips a little bit because they think about it a little bit differently. But if you go back to kind of the way the ancient Jews would think about this, the soul was not a part of you. The soul was you. And here's the idea. We even in our day and age, we tend to separate kind of, the mental side of us and the emotional side of us and the physical side of us and the spiritual side of us, and we just kind of compartmentalize it all. The spiritual side, yeah, I check that box when I go to church on Sunday, right? The physical side, yeah, I check that box when I go for a run, or I don't eat that third cookie. And the mental side, okay, fine. I guess I should probably keep up on the news or read a book. And the emotional side, yeah, I need to laugh every once in a while. And we just kind of check boxes in our life. And sometimes what we miss when we live that way is that all of those things affect all of those things. And so it's incredibly important that the spiritual part of life isn't just like this little box that we devote an hour to each week. It's like part of our whole life because God is with us our whole life. Our physical side, everything from what we take into our bodies to the energy that we exert with our bodies to, how we take care of things like, are we reckless in our activities? That can have serious physical effect. It crosses it, all of those things affect all of those things. And if we can get our way into that type of thinking, that is when we're actually taking care of our souls.
So yesterday we began this discussion, began this whole emphasis on mental health and in particular depression by talking about Elijah. And we're in 1 Kings chapter 19 in particular. You really kind of need to read 1 Kings chapter 18 to get the context and understand. But to make a long story short, Elijah issues a challenge. And in this challenge, God does an extraordinary miracle and demonstrates the truth of Elijah's claims, the reality of his presence and his power, and the prophets and priests of Baal are completely defeated. The priests are destroyed. And after that, Elijah's life is threatened. King Jezebel, who is not a nice lady, says that she is going to make sure that he is put to death. And instead of being this moment of triumph and victory, Elijah is so scared and so overwhelmed, he runs for the hills. And it's from that point on that we kind of move through and understand from this story of Elijah some things that are really important. And we made 3 points. So point number 1 was, don't go it alone. Elijah makes a huge mistake when he takes off and he leaves his servant behind and goes on into the wilderness, because when you and I are isolated, the devil loves to play his games. It's his most effective, most efficient time where he taunts and he torments us. And so point number 1 was, don't go it alone. Point number 2,
That was to take care of your body. So Elijah does something wrong. He basically isolates himself, which, by the way, that's a natural reaction when you're feeling lousy to just want to be alone. And part of the reason I even bring that up is because there are moments, right, when your natural reactions are totally understandable, but that doesn't mean they're best. And so if you're in kind of a depressive moment and you're like, I really don't want to talk about this. I just want to be alone. I get it. I think we all get it. But for your own sake and for the sake of those who love you, fight against that natural reflexive reaction and get to a point where you can ask for even just a little bit of help. And it's not that you have to have some big, huge, long, hours long conversation. Just take that first step to bring yourself out of isolation just a little bit, because it'll be a blessing to you and it'll be a blessing to those who love you. Now, that leads us to for what Elijah does wrong, he goes it alone. Here's what he does right. He takes care of his body because an angel of the Lord shows up and kind of gives him a little help in this department. Elijah does three things. He gets a lot of sleep, which is always a nice thing. Sleep is great. He eats a meal. This is on the tail end of a famine in the nation of Israel. And so Elijah has not been having the best dietary habits. And so the angel provides him miraculously with some food. And then strengthened by that food, the story in 1 Kings 19 says, this is 1 Kings 19, verse 8. He takes a 40-day and 40-night hike until he reaches the mountain of God, Horeb, which is where Moses received the Ten Commandments. So he sleeps, he eats, he exercises, and because everything affects everything, what he does with his body actually does have an effect, right, ultimately, on how he's feeling in his soul.
Well, and it goes back to the thing that you were saying just a few minutes ago, that how our body is, how our mind is, our emotions has a direct impact on our soul because it's all part of our soul. And so don't go it alone. Take care of your body. Then the third point yesterday was deal with depression before it starts. That we have the ability to take our temperature, to understand that whole concept of the temperature and the thermostat, and make adjustments, to realize that it's not something to hide. It's not something to sort of tuck away and pretend like it's not there. If we realize something's not right, we can take proactive steps before it gets worse, before it begins to impact our health and our well-being.
And so those are the 3 points that we made yesterday. And really, in one sense, that's the very beginning of some kind of how-to points. In other words, if you're dealing with depression, let's just get kind of practical and utilitarian and go, okay, so what do I do? Well, don't go it alone. Reach out for some help. Get a little bit of exercise. Get a little bit of rest. Eat in a healthier manner, and then begin to go. Okay, how can I diagnose myself, right? And by the way, you shouldn't just be diagnosing yourself. It's okay to ask for professional help, to say, hey, doc, I need you to take my temperature. Hey, doc, I need you to help me adjust the thermostat of my life. And this actually leads us to some additional points that I'd like to make in the balance of the time that we have today, because half the battle of kind of adjusting the thermostat of your life is just understanding what depression does. Because let's face it, if you've had a bad day, I think we all have, even if you haven't fallen into deep months-long depression. It's funny how quickly your head begins to spin and you begin to go, I'm not sure which way is up, or you feel backed into a corner, or you feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And so just a couple of points about depression to kind of, maybe if you're in that moment, maybe to just remind you, oh yeah, there's more to life than just what I'm feeling at this moment. And so the first thing that I would mention is just keep this in mind, that depression, if you're in the middle of it, has a funny way of distorting your perspective. Depression has a funny way of distorting your perspective. Here's what I mean. We can actually use Elijah to kind of see this come out. Elijah basically takes everything and drags it into his depression. In other words, he doesn't really think enough of anything. He thinks everything is bad and nothing is good. And so let's just start with himself. He doesn't think enough of himself. He has this interesting line in 1 Kings 19, verse 4, where he's like right there on the edge, and he says to God, I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. And then he actually gives us the reason why. I am no better than my ancestors. Now, on the one hand, in kind of a broad theological way, that's kind of true. We're all sinful, okay? We're all kind of broken people. On the other hand, Elijah is kind of using that not as a moment of confession, but as a way to just beat himself up. Because the fact of the matter is, if you look back on the history of the nation of Israel, there were some interesting characters who did a lot of things that Elijah didn't do. King David, a great king, he commits adultery and kills a person. There are lots of people who do some bad stuff. And to basically say, hey, I'm worthless because I'm like all of these other people, it not only fails to grapple with your actual sin by just saying, well, I'm just like everybody else, it also fails to grapple with the accomplishments that you've made and the good things that you've done. And so Elijah basically takes all of that stuff and fails to realize or recognize any of it. And his view of him is completely distorted.
Yeah, our perspective when we're struggling with depression, or when we're struggling with the blues or melancholy, or however you want to describe it, it's hard to think of anything as being good, including ourselves.
And so Elijah not only doesn't think really enough about himself, he also doesn't think enough about God. He doesn't think enough of God. Here's the idea. You mentioned this story earlier in 1 Kings 18. God does this amazing thing where he rains down fire from heaven that burns up an altar and basically makes short work out of false prophets of a false god who's real popular in Israel at this time, whose name is Baal. God embarrasses all the prophets of Baal. He proves that he alone is the real God. And Elijah has just seen this. God can overcome this whole cabal of prophets. But now Elijah doesn't think that God can overcome like an angry woman who's making threats against him. Now, I'll be honest, that doesn't make any logical sense, but often the way that you think when you're in a dark spot doesn't make any logical sense. And so not only does he think himself as worthless, although he would probably never put it in these words, it's almost like he's thinking, well, God ain't good for much of anything either. And so his perspective kind of interpersonally is distorted as he thinks about himself, but his perspective spiritually is also very distorted.
Well, and one of the things that I think it's important for those of us who are loved ones of people who are battling depression, the goal isn't to tell them that their thinking is wrong, or to say, oh, you can't possibly really think that. That's not helpful, right? That their thoughts are their thoughts, and the goal is to adjust that thermostat and to help them adjust that thermostat to get to the point where their thoughts change. Because it doesn't help a depressed person to tell them, no, God is different than that, or that you are better than that, because they simply can't grasp it. They can't believe it.
And Elijah is exactly at that point right now. And this is one of the great things about the Bible. One of the greatest spiritual people in the Old Testament has big spiritual questions about God. And so this is very par for the course when you're deep into depression. Now, the third thing that kind of gets distorted in Elijah's mind is other people. And Jezebel, I'll give her this. She's kind of a tricky woman. In 1 Kings 19, verse 2, she sends a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I don't make your life like that of one of them. Now, let's just play this out logically for a second. If Elijah really just wanted to, if Jezebel really just wanted to kill Elijah, would she be sending messengers to warn him that she was going to kill? Probably not. She would just send a secret hitman and take Elijah out. And so Jezebel's doing something a little clever here, because she knows that her God has just been embarrassed. I mean, big time. So if she can make a threat against the prophet whose God just humiliated her God, and he bites, he takes the bait, and he runs away, that gives Jezebel a whole new lease on the way that she can present Baal. She can simply say, hey, Elijah obviously thought his God was good enough to burn up an altar, but he's not good enough to deal with me. In other words, Elijah may pretend to trust in his God, but he doesn't really trust in his God because he's running from me. And so now Elijah is compromising his witness. All of these people that he's supposed to be leading, he's hurting them. Now, you and I have seen this many times. This is especially, you mentioned, pastors and church workers in need of help. If you're a pastor or a church worker in need of help, get the help you need. Because if you make a huge mistake, you're not only hurting yourself, you're not only hurting your family, you're hurting a lot of people who look to you and love you and count on you to lead them.
When I think about this idea that Elijah doesn't think enough about others, part of what contributes to that deep dark place that he slides into, and part of the reason that he responds to Jezebel's threat the way he does, is because we see a little bit later on when he's on Mount Horeb, when he's there before God, he is completely convinced he's the only one, that no one else has been able to remain faithful. No one else has been able to remain true to God. And he believes that he's alone. And that's a horrible place to be. I mean, if I actually believed that I was the only Christian left, that'd be a scary and a very lonely place.
And so Elijah really is in kind of this deep, dark hole. Okay. Everything around him looks just bad. Now, depression has distorted his perspective. Now, here's the second kind of major point that I want to make, and we'll make these last 2 points fairly quickly. Depression also has distorted his prospective. In other words, it's not just that it's distorted everything around him, it's that he really sees no future. That's why he says, I've had enough, Lord. Just take my life. Just let it all end. Because he didn't really see how there can be any future for him. Now, we said this yesterday. Let's just reiterate it. If that's where you're at, it's time to get some help. Call the National Suicide Hotline. Call the church office. Don't let your prospective be so darkened where you just go, I don't have any sort of future left. Now, again, it doesn't mean that you're somehow unspiritual if that's where you're at. Elijah is here. So it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your spirituality or with your faith. It means that this is a real thing that anyone can fall into.
By the way, that National Suicide Hotline is 800-273-8255. 800-273-8255. So we understand that depression distorts our perspective. We don't see ourselves or God or others the way we should. Depression distorts our perspective. It makes us believe there is no future, there is no hope, which is a lie. And finally, depression needs intervention.
Which is one of the reasons that we're inviting people to call the National Suicide Hotline, because we all need a little bit of help sometime. We all need someone from the outside to come to the inside and just to help us. Now, this actually happens in this story in kind of a small way. It'll happen in another way as we continue the story next week. But in 1 Kings 19, verse 5, Elijah lays down, he falls asleep. And then I love this line. All at once, there's this angel that appears. And the angel, the text says, touches him and says, get up and eat. Now, I'll give you a little bit of Hebrew here. The Hebrew word for touched is the word nagah. It means to strike. And so here's the way I like to put this. Years ago, there was an old show called Touched by an Angel. Yeah, that's not the way it works, okay? Elijah is whacked by an angel, all right? The angel ain't messing around. The angel wants to wake him up and to have a conversation with him. And here's the thing. My guess is it's not very fun to be whacked by an angel. But
it'll wake you up.
But it'll wake you up. And in this particular moment in Elijah's life, it was critically important. Here's the way I think about it. There's this old saying from the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 27, verse 6, wounds from a friend can be trusted. Especially if you're in a dark spot, everything can feel like a wound. Everything, even the nicest, most well-meaning people, right? Saying things in the sweetest way they possibly can. It can still feel like a wound. Remember that proverb. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, even if it hurts, even if it's going to take some work. You still need help.
And that kind of brings us full circle to where we began and the whole point of this series and these isolation Bible studies. If you are struggling with depression or any other kind of mental illness, dear friends, hear us. We love you and we want to be of help to you. And so certainly call the church office, call the National Suicide Hotline for suicide prevention, reach out to a friend, get some guidance and get some involvement, get someone else who's with you, get perspective. Because it could be as easy as having someone say to you, you know what? No, you have been a little bit negative, or you are a little bit withdrawn. And it allows you then to take that temperature reading and then begin to make adjustments. And maybe it's about getting more sleep. Maybe it's about eating a better diet. Maybe it's about getting some regular exercise. Maybe it's about turning off the TV, or as I mentioned yesterday for myself, getting back into that practice, that choice of gratitude on a daily basis. Maybe it's about getting an intervention on the part of a professional, a doctor, consulting your primary care physician or seeing a counselor. But dear friends, there are lots and lots of resources that are available. The key is that if you are struggling in any way, you get help.
And so that's 1 Kings 19. Now, this is a to be continued message, because here's the thing. We have this angel who intervenes, who gives Elijah a little bit of help. But Elijah's not done being helped, because when he gets to the end of his big hike and when he gets to the mountain where Moses receives the 10 Commandments, it's not just an angel who touches him. It's God who speaks to him. And we're going to talk about that side of the story this coming weekend. And so please join us for worship, 8, 9:30 or 11 online on Sunday morning, 5 p.m. Sunday afternoon, 6 p.m. Saturday night, the night before, or you can register for our service. We were worshiping in person for one service on Sunday morning at 9:30, and registration, I think, opens Tuesday afternoon. And so sometime tomorrow afternoon, maybe in the evening before you go to bed, hop on the website, concordia.cc, register you and your family, and we'd love to see you in person or online for worship this weekend.
So, dear friends, if this conversation has been helpful to you, or if the message yesterday was helpful, share it with a friend. Pass it along, because there are lots and lots of folks who need help, who are going through a difficult time. But thanks for joining us for Isolation Bible Study. I hope you have a great rest of the day.